Welcome back to Echo Ridge. Today, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about building a gunk boiler. For those who are not familiar, gunk is a byproduct that comes from the new bionic dupes. As they use up their gear oil, they produce an equal amount of gunk. And every so often, they have to get rid of the gunk using the gunk extractor. And in the early game when you're using the bionic dupes, you're going to come over to the apothecary and make gear balm. You're going to add some clean water to the gunk and then whammo blammo, they get fresh gear balm. And that could work indefinitely. But once you get access to phyto or crude oil, it's better to use the lubrication station. The reason being is it is a potential source of positive morale for your bionic duplicants. Here you can see the dupe gets a +3 due to having fresh oil. And that's a buff they will not get from using the gear balm. But once you start doing that, you're going to end up with a significant source of gunk. In fact, it'll end up being 200 kilos per duplicant every 4 cycles. Well, when we look up gunk in the database, we can see that it's comprised of 2 materials. The first being 92% petroleum and the other 8% sulfur. So if you think about it in this way, this is another method for turning crude oil into petroleum instead of using a petroleum boiler. Because you take the crude oil and you give it to the bionic dupes in the lubrication station, well then all that crude oil becomes gunk and is extracted in the gunk extractor. And then if we boil that gunk, we'll end up with the petroleum. Now granted, this is not a 1-to-1 ratio like it is with the petroleum boiler. You'll be starting with 100% crude oil and ending up with 92% petroleum. But depending on the needs of your colony, that sulfur could come in very handy. Whether it's for feeding grubfruit plants to create grubfruit and spindly grubfruit, or feeding divergents to not only get their meat, but also sucrose and mud. So in a very real way, you can now go from crude oil to mud and sucrose. Okay, Echo, I can see the benefits of boiling gunk. How do we do it? Well, this is not the way. I've gone through many designs in probably about the last 2 months. This was probably Mark II, I believe, and the designs I was trying always ended up by producing, instead of petroleum and sulfur, one of the community's favorite elements, sour gas. So in the past couple of weeks, while I've been away from YouTube while setting up a new studio, I've been thinking about some updated designs, and ending up with this, which is so far produced quite a lot of petroleum and about 2 tons of sulfur without a hitch. Additionally, thanks to the liquid dev pump, I'm able to simulate 10 kilos worth of gunk per second. And without a single issue, we've turned every last bit of that gunk into petroleum and sulfur. This was the design where I had my breakthrough, and I want to show you some of the positives and negatives about it that led me to my final design. First, I realized it was essential that the gunk itself could not hit a base plate. And what I mean by a base plate is typically with a petroleum boiler or other such designs, we use a heat spike and use a door to control whenever it is transferring heat and when it's not transferring heat. For those you do not know, a door in this configuration, closed, is transferring quite a lot of thermals. Open, it's a vacuum, and you can't transfer thermals in a vacuum. So in configurations like this, what would happen is that gunk would hit the base plate, and even though the thermals were not very hot, or at least hot enough to produce sour gas, which you get from boiling petroleum above a temperature of 540, the issue is that gunk only comes out at 10 kilos per second. So it very quickly turns into petroleum, and if it's too hot, also produces sour gas. So with that lesson learned, I realized we need a more stable temperature control, and our threshold is from 447.9, the boiling point of gunk, to 538.9, the boiling point of petroleum, where we create the sweet, sweet sour gas. So that's why I started this revision by not dropping the gunk onto the base plate itself, but rather into a pool of petroleum that is preheated, so that there's a buffer, a rather large buffer, of a few tons of petroleum that can absorb the variation in temperature, allowing the gunk to boil. Well, you may have noticed that when the gunk boils, it produces liquid petroleum, but is supposed to produce solid sulfur. Well, if I zoom in a little bit, you can see that for a fraction of a second, it does produce the solid sulfur. The issue is sulfur melts at 115.2, and when it does melt, it turns into liquid sulfur. Well, liquid sulfur also flashes at 337 to sulfur gas. And as you can see, we have the gas going up to a chill room provided by a thermal aqua tuner and steam turbine setup, which is then recondensing that liquid sulfur back into its solid form. Insert revision Mark III. Here I was trying a staircase design, but as you can see, if I bring up the overlay, we're getting liquid sulfur here and there, and then you end up with a mess when you're trying to capture the petroleum, because there wasn't a good separation between the sulfur and the petroleum. So if we don't heat up that liquid sulfur enough to turn it into sulfur gas, there's a chance it'll end up flowing down with the petroleum, which would be fine as long as we were able to get back down to 115.2 to turn it back into sulfur. Well, when you have two liquids that are supposed to be counterflowing, in this case it's gunk and petroleum, and you add a third liquid, it's going to throw the thermals off. Not to mention, in this example, the petroleum's sitting around 167 degrees. Which then led me to this revision. I needed a way to make sure that we were only getting petroleum where we wanted petroleum. And this is the key to that design. When we build one of these, which we will in just a minute, you want to make sure before you turn anything on that this lock is in place. Because once the petroleum's there, sulfur, or in this case sulfur gas, can't join the fun. And then the only other place for the gas to go is into our chill chamber. So while it is brute force in the fact that the sulfur gas starts out at 460 and ends up at about 73 degrees sulfur, but in the end it's not too bad because, remember, it's only 8% of sulfur being produced as a byproduct of this process. With this being my first successful design, why didn't I just keep and roll with it? Well, there's still a couple of things I didn't love about it. First, you'll notice I'm having to cool the liquid pump using the thermal aqua tuner loop. And because it's coming in contact, even though we're using a conduction panel, with that hot petroleum, this thermal aqua tuner has been running 88% of the time for the last 5 cycles. Alright, so I know I want a different method of keeping the liquid pump cool. Well, to understand the solution to that, you have to realize where I started with in this process. Well, as you can sort of tell from this design being butted out, the liquid pump started off over here. The problem was the polluted water couldn't keep up with the cooling required. And while I am counterflowing it with the gunk, another important learning lesson from this process is that gunk has a specific heat capacity of 1.2 and a thermal conductivity of 1.5. Petroleum is 1.76 and 2. So in a way, when it comes to thermals, the petroleum's always going to be able to beat out the gunk. Well, my stopgap solution was just to move the pump further away. Because our gunk is coming in at a constant temperature, whether it's using a liquid dev pump or coming out of your bionic dupes, we just needed more room for the gunk to be able to cool down the petroleum. That combined with this cooling loop did the trick. You'll notice though that gunk that started off at 30-something degrees is ending up at around 257. So it's requiring a little bit more heat than our final design. A way we can see that is by going to the properties on this door, and you can see in the last 5 cycles, it's ran 3% per cycle. Which, that's not too bad. That's an incredibly low amount of heat that we're drawing from this biome. But what if I gave the gunk an even longer chance to be able to counterflow with the petroleum? Well, insert the tried and true method of counterflow that we use in the petroleum boiler. Here you can see that airlock's only been used 0.8% of the time, which is a significant improvement over the last design. Additionally, using this method, I didn't need the cooling loop that is chilling the sulfur to also be used to keep the liquid pump cool. It stays around 180 degrees. In fact, the larger you make this counterflow exchanger, the cooler the liquid pump and thus the cooler the petroleum is going to be. In this case, our final temperature on the petroleum is about 160 degrees, and the sulfur is coming out at 80.9. Not too shabby. Notice on this design, we still have the sort of liquid lock here, ensuring that there's no chance liquid sulfur is going to end up in our counterflow exchanger. There's something else I wanted to do here that I will end up doing in future designs, and that's the use of a timer sensor. So instead of the auto sweeper trying to pick up tiny little grams worth of sulfur, once the timer sensor goes into its red portion, it'll turn off the auto sweeper, allowing much bigger chunks of sulfur to be produced. That way, when the auto sweeper does go and pick them up, it's not trying to just pick up small tiny gram packets. And that's sort of it. Notice in this design too that the gunk is not falling onto the boiler plate. It is right beside it. I have a temperature shift plate that is assisting the spreading of the temperature from these metal tiles into the petroleum pool. I'm also using temperature shift plates to absorb a lot of the thermals. Notice this temperature shift plate is sitting at 25 degrees. So as soon as the sulfur gas or liquid sulfur comes in contact with it, it pretty quickly turns into solid sulfur. And more on the efficiency front, you can see this thermal aqua tuner in the past 5 cycles has only ran 17% of the time. Much improved over the 90% of the Mark V design, I believe. You'll notice there's a signal switch here. This is useful when you are constructing this. That way you can have the automation in place and you can send a green signal. That way you can keep this door open to ensure that these metal tiles don't keep transferring in from the diamond while you're getting everything built. But once it's built, the thermosensor takes control because remember, a green signal always overrides a red signal. Now I am going to go step by step and build another one of these, but they do take quite some time, so I am going to be using the assistance of sandbox mode. But fear not, I will be building one of these in our max dupe series. So since I'm going to be doing it by dupe hands then, I figured it wouldn't be too bad if I use sandbox today. First, we start with a vacuumed out area. In this case, I vacuumed out, well, the entire biome. That way I can continue to do more and more silly designs. But once we do have a vacuum, we then build in our diamond window tile heat spike. It is key when you're doing this that you have to make sure that the heat spike is going into obsidian. And this is only due to the fact that we can no longer do the sideways door trick, whereas a dupe would build through a door where you could sort of push the magma out of the way. Nowadays, you just need to find a good enough source of obsidian to stick in your heat spike. That way none of the magma spills over. Before I finish building the heat spike, I'm going to put in a steel mechanized airlock. And once you build it, you'll notice the door starts out shut. Hence the reason I use the signal switch, sending out a green signal to open the door before I finally finish building the window tiles. Now, it does not matter, that door will never get hot. Well, at least until we shut the signal switch off. I'll then wrap this in insulated tile, just in case any messes happen. You do not want them to hit 1200 degree diamond tiles. And then finally we'll put in our boiler plate. Remember, the boiler plate needs to be made out of steel. You can go with some other metals, but I find steel strikes a perfect medium because of its thermal conductivity. If we were to use something like aluminum, not only would it melt at 660 degrees, but it may heat up too fast because of its increased thermal conductivity. I'm then going to build the pool that all that petroleum is going to sit in, keeping in mind that I do want a 1 tile gap before we end up going into our sour gas condenser room. Now for the room size, I like to use 1 auto sweeper's width. That way no matter where the solid sulfur falls, you can always grab it. I'll also build the wall up over on this side. You don't really have to do that, but I don't want to make a mess out of the rest of the biome. Now I've already built a thermal aqua tuner and steam turbine setup, so I'm just going to stop using this guy and end up using a cooling loop coming from here. Remember the point I made earlier, the fact that this thermal aqua tuner has only ran 17% in the last 5 cycles. So you really don't need too much potential cooling. So most cooling loops that you already have will do just fine. As a note, I have been using just polluted water. It's important to me that we're able to build these in the mid-game. That way you will always have access to the materials being used. Nothing here is built with anything better than steel, igneous rock, insulated tiles, and we use polluted water as a coolant. But needless to say, if you had access to supercoolant and thermium, well, you could do a lot more. Now I am going to make one small change. you can see that the petroleum forms a small lock right here, and I do not want that to happen. I want the petroleum just to flow through. That's the reason why the floor here is a bit higher. So now I can start my counterflow exchangers. The longer the better. I'm going to use sandbox mode to make a little bit more room. And there we go. So now we know whatever source of gunk we have is going to come in through here. In all of my tests, I've been using copper radiant pipes. And we're going to have it go up and around, counterflowing with the petroleum that is falling. And then we're going to switch over to insulated because I do not want this tile here to be able to superheat whatever's in the pipes. Remember, this is the level of petroleum that we're shooting for. That way it drips down through here. If it was one lower, say something like this, your counterflow exchanger would be connected to the same thermals as this pool of petroleum. Additionally, all this petroleum would still be connected to all the petroleum on this level, which is exactly what we do not want. Hence the reason why we always have a drop off here, so the petroleum in this pool is not connected to the petroleum here. Speaking of which, to start off with, we need to fill this up with petroleum. It is a requirement. You cannot just start by using gunk. And the reason why is, if you remember, you have to have this lock in place. Otherwise, you're going to end up with sulfur gas or liquid sulfur in your counterflow exchanger. Remember, our door is still open, which, by the way, I'm grabbing power from my last example, but any old house power will work. As a note, I did try to see if this system could be self-powered. It really can't. Even with the thermal aqua tuner not running that often, you have a liquid pump being used constantly at 240 watts. Now, I did say you had to charge this whole system with petroleum, but technically you could use crude oil. It would just be a little bit more cumbersome, because once we fill this pool up with crude oil or petroleum, we're then going to heat it. And you could just flash all that crude oil into petroleum. While doing so, you'll probably need to be picking up a little bit of mess as some of the crude oil flows over, but in this case, it's safer just to use petroleum from the rip. You may say, Echo, well, where am I going to get petroleum? Well, if you're switching your duplicants off of Gear Bomb and using crude oil, you can just use the oil refinery to turn it all into petroleum until you get this system up and going. As we can see, we've just now hit that point where the petroleum is flowing into our lock. So I can disconnect it from here. And now we are charged and just about ready. Some of the final touches, I need to remember my conveyor loader. We have our conveyor chute. As said earlier, I like putting a timer on my auto sweepers in these instances for the simple reason I don't want that auto sweeper active, but maybe once per cycle. I'll of course need power for this, and I'll just connect into the previous one. And then for the cooling loop, I'll bring it in like I said. I am going to use some conduction panels to make sure our auto sweeper conveyor loader do not overheat. So using insulated tiles, I'm going to come in here, go out, and then heading into our condenser, I'm going to use that same copper radiant. And then from here, I will send the cooling loop back out the way it came. Notice the cooling loop is not active over here or above the petroleum pool. And this is because I don't want liquid sulfur to appear anywhere but here. In fact, I could even raise the insulated tile probably by 1 to ensure we're not getting any flashing over here. I'm going to add my temperature shift plates. In this example, up here, I'm not going to use diamond because I wanted to keep thermals for longer. If I wanted to transfer thermals quicker, that's when you use the diamond temperature shift plate. And in that example, I am going to put the diamond temperature shift plate here. Can't forget the thermal sensor down here. We'll connect that right into the door. Make sure when you are building that, you keep the signal switch on. And in this revision, I've had this thermal sensor set at 455. And you notice the gunk doesn't stay, but for a fraction of a second. So this is probably about perfect. So in your testing, anywhere from say 455 to 460 will be fine. I'm going to go with the tried and true 460 and say if it is above 460 degrees, I need you to send a green signal and open this door. The last thing I need is a way to get all the petroleum out. We're going to use our standard liquid pump, made out of steel, of course, because that petroleum is hot. And in this case, I'm just going to dump all this petroleum. But in your colony, you send it wherever you're using your petroleum generators. I'll make sure it has some power. As a note, it doesn't really matter if you allow it to backfill up with some petroleum, so long as it doesn't get all the way up here. Ooh, I caught it just in time. There was some hot obsidian here. In fact, that can go away too. Yep, that abyssalite's too hot. All right, now we should be good. And that's sort of it. I think we're ready to start this. We have our thermosensor in place, so I can turn off the signal switch. We don't have any gunk coming in yet. It'll take a few minutes for this reservoir to heat up to the 460 degrees. And you do not want to start adding gunk until it is hot enough. While that's heating up, we can grab our gunk. You can grab it directly from your gunk extractors, although I recommend putting in some buffer tanks because the buffer tank is truth, and then head off towards your gunk boiler. In this case, I will be using the liquid dev pump just for ease of use. I don't have any bionic tubes in the laboratory. Let me make sure I do not connect that yet until this is heated. And after a few minutes, our door has opened because the thermosensor has sensed that it's at 460 degrees. Notice we're starting to get a little bit of boiling from the petroleum. Absolutely love this new graphic update from the devs. And that is because petroleum will flash at around 540 degrees. So we are ready to connect our gunk. And all said and done, as long as you put the petroleum in place correctly, you have your thermosensor and everything set correctly in your cooling loop, the system itself is pretty simple. Here comes our first bit of gunk coming out of the liquid vent, and perfect flashing just like we wanted to see. We already see the sulfur rain, and it's appearing only because all these pipes and everything are much cooler, but after a little while they will heat up as well. But that is also why it is so important, because you can see this liquid sulfur here, and if you had, for instance, 2 tiles open, well, liquid sulfur or sulfur gas would end up flooding this compartment and giving you a very bad day on your colony. But the petroleum's coming out, it hits this tile around 380, 390 degrees, and by the time it hits all the way at the bottom here, it's down to about 100, which is plenty cool enough for our steel liquid pump. I'll fast forward this for a few minutes so you can see as it transitions into being fully functional. Notice we're getting more sulfur gas, and that's due to the liquid sulfur finally evaporating here. Oh, is another point. I should have put insulated tiles at the very top here. That way we don't get any of the flaking off from the abyssalite that's sitting at 73 degrees. Some other design notes that I took into account. You'll notice I did not make this 3 tiles wide. It could work, but you could also run into pressure problems. So I decided to make it 4 wide to ensure we didn't crack any of these insulated tiles. And notice that the sulfur gas is no longer as thick as the whole system sort of kicks in. We're getting our nice sulfur buildup right here. And once per cycle, the auto sweeper will turn back on, taking all of this sulfur out and dropping it off right over here. And there you have it. At long last, a functional gunk boiler. For those of you just watching the tutorial and have not yet seen the max duplicant run that I am currently in, we are driving up towards 200 duplicants, 100 standard dupes, and 100 boops. If you're interested in seeing this being built in a standard Let's Play, I'll be doing that in my next max dupe episode. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about this design in the comments below. And if you're looking for anything else to comment with, maybe you can help me figure out a better name than this standard gunk boiler. So until next time, much love, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you soon.